This is to weed or repair. Everybody in the right classroom, so to speak. So to start out with, we're going to talk a little bit about weeding, and we're going to talk about why we weed and why we wouldn't weed, which would make sense since this is weed or repair. So weeding, a few notes. The library is neither a warehouse nor a museum. So by saying that, what I mean is the library is neither a place to keep a record of all information that you can get your hands on, nor is it a museum. We want to preserve the items that we do have for continued use, but we're not trying to preserve them for all time. Excuse me. Ranganathan, if you're familiar with the philosopher librarian Ranganathan, his fifth law of library science is that the library is a living organism. And so what this means is that the library is not meant to be static. It's meant to be dynamic. And that's where weeding comes in. Weeding is the removal of materials no longer needed. It is the removal of materials that have become too damaged. And it is the removal of materials that you need to get rid of for other reasons. And those we can get into 100 tiny reasons. But it's a continuing process, not a one-time project. I think it's something that a lot of librarians put off because it's not fun. Some of these decisions are hard to make. But if it is a continuing process and not a one-time project, it's less overwhelming, and you can keep up the overall health of your library. So I would hope that a lot of you already know the basics of weeding, but just to give us a good foundation, I thought I would mention the basics. First of all, does your library have a policy that covers weeding? A lot of libraries will have something in their policy. Sometimes it's in collection development, sometimes it's its own policy. There is, at the end of this presentation, there are resources that I list. One of them is a link on the ALA website about writing policy. So I would encourage you to look at the resources and further reading at the end of the presentation. But a great resource, and it's free online, is the CREW method. This is from Texas Public Libraries, but it's very well known, and it's, I think, from 1995, but it's still considered accurate. So to summarize some important parts of CREW, is the book still circulating and when did it last check out? Different libraries have different cutoffs for this. Sometimes it's in the last 3 years, sometimes in the last 5 years, sometimes in the last 10 years. But that is a factor when considering weeding. Is the information in the book still accurate? This is something, criteria that you see more often in academic libraries, but it still counts for public libraries. Is the information, if it's a nonfiction book, is that still accurate? Have new developments happened? Is the book still relevant to your community's needs or interests? This applies a little bit more to public libraries. So is that book still popular, or is it not being read anymore? And if needed, can this book still be borrowed from elsewhere through interlibrary loan? So maybe there is one patron who's still checking out the book. And if that's the case, it's kind of up to you to make a judgment call whether to keep that book or not. But if you think maybe you'll get one more circulation out of it in the next year, year and a half, go ahead and weed it if it's available elsewhere through interlibrary loan. All right. So, oh, I'm gonna go back there, sorry. When considering weeding instead of, repair, excuse me, instead of disposal. So there's a couple of things to consider when you're trying to make the decision between weeding, i.e. disposal, or repair. So first of all, how valuable is this book? And this can be a much longer involved conversation, but can it be more easily replaced than repaired? If it's a book that's still in print, or you can still buy a copy of it, especially if it's cheaper, why are you not buying a new copy. It'll save you time. It'll be in better repair. Another thing to consider is how long will the repair that you're doing last. The fact is that a repaired book is already weakened. I won't say it's on its last legs, but it's kind of on its last legs. You're giving it, a few more circulations of use. Will it need multiple repairs? You're making one repair now. Can you see that you'll need to make another repair later? And how much time and effort do you want to invest and money in the repair? And this is something we'll come back to a little bit later in the presentation. I wanted to note a kind of an exception here. If the book is local history, in this case, it's probably a book that there's maybe less than 50 copies in existence, maybe even less than that. And it's obviously information that's valuable to your community, and so you want to keep it on those grounds, even if it doesn't circulate. The good rule of thumb when working with local history books that are in disrepair is to do the least extensive repair possible, because you know that this book probably won't get a lot of circulation. You're just trying to arrest the current damage. You're not trying to prevent further damage from further use. And I would strongly consider making an archival copy of the book or a digital copy. This is allowable under copyright. And if you have questions about that, you can certainly email or call SEK later, and we'll be able to walk you through that copyright questions in that process. Making an archival copy of the book can be in physical form, copying it on paper, or you can even consider making a scan of it, making a digital copy available. So let's say we've decided to keep the book. I wanted to take kind of a short bunny trail here and talk about paper quality and talk about a short history of paper, because I found it to be interesting as a librarian and also useful when looking at the condition of books. So early paper was made from linen rags by hand. With the Industrial Revolution and the invention of the cotton gin, they moved to cotton. But to increase output and decrease the waste of products, chlorine was introduced to break down fibers faster and produce white paper more quickly. This allowed them to use more of the tree and a wider variety of wood pulp. But when exposed to air, acid forms from the chlorine left in the paper being exposed to air. So this was a problem. Paper was breaking down pretty quickly. They knew right away that this was an issue. So they switched to wood pulp over cotton fibers, and without proper washing of the pulp, which takes time and cost, lignin, which is a naturally occurring the complex organic polymer is the phrasing, but it's like a resin left in the wood, is left in the paper, which breaks down into an acid when exposed to air also. So another problem. This was shortly before around the 1850s, shortly before the 1850s when all this was happening. Several innovations later, they started using sodium hydroxide or sodium sulfate to wash the lignin out of the paper, but then they had to worry about the sodium hydroxide or sodium sulfate in the paper. So they went with a rosin and alum process to both remove the lignin and stabilize the cellulose, which was a lot better than chlorine, but there was still an acid breakdown. It was just slower than the previous paper method. And this method to mass produce paper used in book publishing was pretty much the standard across the board until the early to mid 1980s, when the university presses in particular, who were more likely to produce books that were going to stay around on bookshelves longer for educational use, started pushing for the use of paper made through an acid-free process, because there are acid-free processes. They're just more expensive and they take more time. But most mass market paperbacks and most paperbacks today still use the cheaper acidic paper. Some of the hardback books do, some of the hardback books don't. Over time, acidic paper will become yellow and brittle. And I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about. Think of any paperback that's at least 10 years old on your shelves, and you know the edges are starting to turn yellow. So how to recognize mass market, cheaply produced paper versus the archival and acid-free paper? Well, first of all, like I was talking about, there's the telltale yellowing around the edges of the paper where the paper is exposed to the air. But secondly, you can look for this symbol in books or on packages of paper that you're considering purchasing for printing in your own home, that tells you it is archival quality and produced in an acid-free manner. I'm not trying to trash the paper that they use for mass market paperbacks. I mean, it's a cheaper option. It makes for less expensive books. And I think in the publisher's minds, they're not expecting those paperbacks to last beyond about 5 or 10 years at most. But it's something to watch for. So moving on from paper quality, there's also types of book bindings. And I have 4 examples in pictures here, and then I'm going to stop sharing the presentation screen and show you some live examples of these bookbinding methods. But first we have the old-fashioned sewn book bindings, and that is starting from the upper left and working clockwise with the pictures. This is what we all know and love. These kinds of books are very flexible with the spine. They're more often used with heavier papers because that kind of binding allows for a lot more flexibility and strength at the same time. But it is time consuming. There are machine methods to stitch bindings, but at some point in the process, there still needs to be human interaction. It can't be completely machined. So moving over to the upper right, we have a glued binding. And the picture of this glued binding is when the binding glue is still young and flexible. You see a lot of textbooks these days produced with a glued binding. The positives of a glued binding are that it's much easier to bind together different types and qualities of paper. Because unlike a sewn binding where you have to worry about how the needle is going to punch through the paper and about the strength of the thread, glue is glue. Also, glued bindings can be completely machine produced, and so it is a cheaper production model, and they can take paperbacks. This is probably the biggest reason for doing a glued binding, is that it's a paperback book. Moving down to the lower right, we have a stapled binding. I hesitated to include this because most places will call this a booklet rather than a book when it's stapled like this in the spine. But I know that a lot of children's books use this kind of stapling, and they're books in that we put them in our library collection and we circulate them like books. And it breaks down also. So moving down to the bottom left, this is sometimes called a hybrid binding. There's different names for it. Most often it's called a hybrid binding. I call it a Frankenbinding. And I'll be able to explain this a little bit more with the live example. But basically what this is they start kind of like a sewed binding. They've got signatures, which are different sections of paper of the book. And they do shoot threads through the interior fold. But rather than stitching it all together on the spine, once those threads are through, once those threads are through, they glue the back of that binding. And you can tell the difference between a sewn binding and a glued binding because, as you can see in the pictures, the sewn binding is still flexible. The glued binding, where it hits the back spine, is glued to the back spine. It is not flexible at that point. And so the difference is the stress on the pages in the sewn binding is in the fold, and it is in where the stitching is. In a hybrid or Frankenbinding, in my terminology, the stress on the pages are where it hits the edges of the binding. And with these Frankenbindings, you see a lot of hinge separation, which we'll get to as one of the repairs we're going to go over. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and kind of show you in real life what I'm talking about. And first of all, we're going to look at a book with a sewn binding. I'm showing you this one because the back spine has come off, and so we can see the stitching. This is called kettle stitching, and I'm sorry, those of you on the iPhone, you're not going to be able to see the pictures, the video, but I will do my best to explain here. This is called a kettle stitch. You can see it pierces the paper at one, 2, 3, 4, 5, about between 5 and 10 places, depending on how you count the stitches. Each signature or set of pages you can see separately. And also, if you turn it on the side here, the binder has also added tapes at each signature that go into the hardback here, which this book has seen a lot of use and a lot of repair over the years. This floral paper on it is not the original cover here. So if we look in the book, we can see evidence of a sewn binding in the pages, and it does take a little hunting to find the middle of a signature if it's a well-bound book. And this one obviously has. It has stood up to a lot of abuse. You will see these stitches in the Franken binding also. So I'll hold the picture up there. I don't know if you can see way in the crease there, the stitches. They're kind of hard to see over video there. So moving on from that one, we're going to look at a glued spine. So this is a paperback. It's not a mass market paperback though. It's a somewhat well-produced paperback. So this is a glued binding. We can see there's no stitching, any evidence of stitching, and we can see a little bit. We can see the separate signatures where the glue has gone into between the separate signatures. If we open it up, first of all, it doesn't open up quite as wide as a sewn binding. There's only so wide it'll open before you're in danger of cracking the spine. This one is a relatively young book. It was published in 1995, so the glue is still young and supple enough. But on some mass market paperbacks, the cheaply produced ones, they also use a cheaper glue, and so you can tell, when paperback books are the spine, the glue is dried out in the spine, and the pages are coming out. So that's a glued binding. And then we get to what I call Franken binding. So this book still has its dust cover, which I'm going to take off so we can look at it a little bit more closely. The advantage of a Franken binding or a hybrid binding is that it provides a little bit more strength and flexibility than a glued binding, and it can be used with hardback books, but it is not as expensive as a sewn binding. So in this case, when we open it up, you can see in the spine where pages flex and hit against the edges of the spine there. And if we're looking at the pages this way, we can see that the pages don't lie as flat. The book doesn't want to open as much. It is possible to find the middle of a signature with a Franken binding, but it is a lot harder. Some Franken bindings, like I said, they use threads. They kind of shoot in and then glue at the back spine. Some Franken bindings don't use, they still have the holes like it would be sewn, but they just shoot glue through those holes. It really depends on the press. I think when I first became aware of this was when the 7th Harry Potter book came out. The first editions that came out to bookstores on opening night was probably the worst example of this Franken binding or hybrid binding that I've ever seen. The books fell apart so quickly. Later later runs of the book that came out were a little bit more well-bound, but I definitely noticed it. In this book, it is, I almost found the middle of a signature. As you can see, the difficulty that I'm having, I don't think I'll put you through it. It's very difficult to find the the signature middle. And lastly is the stapled booklet. I mean, this is pretty self-explanatory, but I'm just here to round out the examples. If you can see the staples there, if you open it to the very middle of the book, the staples are in the very middle of the book. In effect, this is one signature. This whole book is just one signature. A signature is a section of pages, if you're unfamiliar with the term. All right, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen so we can go back to the presentation. All right. So now that we know kind of the different bindings that we're looking at and the strengths and weaknesses of each bookbinding type, I wanted to talk just really quickly about preventative measures. These are things you do before the book is has suffered. And these are things that libraries decide to do on a library-to-library basis. You would decide to do them as a proactive measure rather than a reactive measure to the damage on your books. So these preventative measures can include deciding to not buy paperback books, or if you do buy paperback books, deciding not to buy mass market paperback books, knowing that they might require more repair in the future than a hardback book. Or if you're going to purchase a hardback book, knowing the difference between a hybrid binding and a sewn binding and this would be more for books that you're planning on keeping a little bit longer, like reference books or nonfiction books. Knowing what binding you're looking at will tell you kind of the quality of the book and the kind of repairs that you'll be looking at in the future. Covering dust jackets with Mylar and securing them will help preserve hardback book covers from dirt and damage, but they will not prevent the book from damage due to opening and closing or torn pages. They are worth it if you're a library that wants to keep the dust jackets with the books. And sometimes the dust jackets, you know, that's where the artwork is. That's where the advertising for the book is. So you want to keep it. It's, you know, sometimes definitely worth doing. If you choose to cover your paperback books with plastic, you will need to take into consideration the cost of the plastic and your time to process it. Would it be cheaper just to buy a duplicate of that paperback? Will the book receive enough use to justify putting plastic on it in the first place? There are commercial products available. One of the big ones is called Cap Coat with a K. And then I've also seen some librarians use contact paper, but a note of caution with contact paper, make sure that you're using a high quality acid-free contact paper if you use that to cover some paperback books. Because contact paper was developed as a sticky shelf paper, not as a book covering material. Just some things to keep in mind if you're thinking about what can I do to prevent damage in the first place. So before we get to repair, I wanted to talk a little bit about cleaning options. So we know that books don't circulate when they're dirty or damaged. There are several cleaning options available. There's a waterless cleaning paste. Demco makes it. There's also one that's available just on Amazon called Absorberine. I cannot pronounce that. Absorberine? No. Anyway, you can see the word on your screen. These are good. The Demco waterless cleaning paste is good for paper that has some kind of plastic coating on it or some kind of coating on it. The other one is a little bit better for more absorbent matte paper. They both have their pluses and minuses. I would suspect that you're going to be cleaning more children's books than adult books. So keep that in mind. In light of recent world affairs, I will note that these are not disinfectants. They are only there to clean the dirt. So there's some other cleaning options. There's the good old white eraser. Oftentimes we think about these erasers to use to erase pencil, but they can erase dirt also. You want to be very gentle with them. They come with several different names: high polymer, Mars plastic, vinyl. I've seen all of these types. You can find them at office supply stores, at art stores. You can order them through library supply companies. If you're needing to deodorize the books, I've had a lot of librarians suggest activated charcoal, putting the books in a bin with an activated charcoal sachet. And they make these for closets, and sealing it in for a day or two. This is in the case of maybe smoke, a strong smoke smell, or if it comes in with some other kind of smell. We know that this can be very off-putting to people wanting to check out the book after it's been returned, smelly. Another option is sandpaper, and I would caution you when considering this option. You will want to make some trials with different grits of sandpaper, and every book is going to be a little bit different. This is to be used in a book that can be tightly closed and has enough pages to present a smooth surface that you can sand. But this can be a good option if you have a book that is particularly dirty. Maybe it's been in a smoky or particularly dusty environment, and you've dusted it, tried wiping it with a soft cloth, it's just not coming off. You can, if you can compress the pages tight enough, lightly use some sandpaper to freshen up the edges of the book. So, a book repair. We're coming back to the conversation that we kind of started at the beginning. Before you add that book to the repair pile, how much is too much work? So you are maybe being paid an hourly wage, or you can figure out what your hourly wage is if you're on salary, and think about how much time you're using to repair that book, and write it out in dollars and cents, and ask yourself, okay, at this point, would it be cheaper to buy a replacement, if that's possible? Also, beyond the monetary value of your time, I know as directors and librarians at small libraries, you have to make decisions. You have to have priorities about what you want to get done. And so maybe it still would be cheaper to repair the book, but are you taking time away from something else? So we talked about the cost of repair in supplies, well, in time, but also the cost of supplies to repair the book. The book repair methods that I'm going to show you today, I've tried to make as low cost as possible, but there is still some cost involved with buying glue and having other supplies on hand to repair books. And then lastly, how long will the repair last? How long you're expecting to extend the life of the book? Some repairs, in repairing a damage or a break somewhere, you're turning around and putting more stress on a different part of the book, which will cause a tear or a break later down the road. And maybe the best you can do for the repair, will only last 3 or 4 more circulations, thinking specifically of children's books that get a lot of heavy use. And so in doing that repair, is that going to be worth however many more circulations you can get out of it? So now we're going to talk about the book repair supplies for the different repair methods we're going to go over today. The first one is book tape. This comes in several different brands. Scotch makes it, 3M makes it, Demco makes it. They come in different widths, but what they all have in common is the adhesive is acid-free and non-yellowing. And also the adhesive is a little bit more strong and flexible than packing tape, which when I worked at an academic library, the student workers that would handle interlibrary loan were forever saying, why can't we just use the book tape to package up interlibrary loan boxes? And I would have to explain to them, there's a difference between book tape and packing tape, and no, you cannot use the book tape to seal that box. I think sometimes patrons also confuse book tape with packing tape, and they want to repair their own books. I will say that book tape I would only use on paperback books, and I would only use on exterior of books. The plastic that is the plastic part of book tape is thick, and if you're using it to repair a tear, which I don't think you would be, but the hinge on the inside, by adding more bulk to that stress point, you're just transferring the damage from where it's already been done to another part of the book if you use something like book tape that is too thick. And the other thing I have on the screen is liquid plastic adhesive. I'm using its generic name, liquid plastic adhesive, but a lot of librarians will know this better by Norbond, which I think is sold exclusively by Demco now. And it's like the difference between facial tissue and Kleenex. Norbond is a liquid plastic adhesive. It is acid-free. It stays flexible longer than, say, acid-free Elmer's glue. And it doesn't dry out. We all know that, like Elmer's glue does, because I've had people ask, well, can't we just use white Elmer's glue? You can if you don't care about the repair after about 2 or 3 years. Excuse me, or shorter, depending on environmental factors. And if you trust that white glue to be strong enough. The Norbond liquid plastic adhesive is going to be just a little bit stronger. There are other names for this also, and other brands that you can research. But like I said, by far the liquid plastic adhesive is the most popular. And then here's some more household goods that can be popular. Wax paper. Library book repair supply companies will try to sell you all kinds of fancy coated papers, but I found that good old wax paper will work most of the time. And then wooden skewers. I have the picture there of the fruit on the skewer to illustrate the size of the skewer, but going with one of these thinner, kind of cheaper bamboo skewers and using the blunt end, not the pointy end, to spread glue is going to work better than a paintbrush because paintbrushes absorb the glue and it'll dry in the bristles and it's just a mess. If you use a bamboo skewer, use the blunt end of a bamboo skewer, it's disposable. You can be much more precise about where you're putting the glue, and they're pretty inexpensive. So lastly on my list of book repair supplies, good old rubber bands, but I'm talking about the wide rubber bands. In using rubber bands in book repair, you don't want the rubber bands to be too tight. That's a mistake that you see often in book repair, is they've used rubber bands, which is fine, but they've tightened them too much, and you're left with the indentation of the rubber band when you take it off. So using rubber bands is great. Just use the wider ones, use one that is gonna not be stretched too taut when you use it. So don't use the cheap rubber bands that you get around newspapers. Go ahead and buy those wider rubber bands. And you will have to resupply rubber bands. They do dry out, they crack, they snap on you. But it can be a good alternative if you don't have a book press, because who has a book press anymore for a repair? Yeah, oh, you do. Go ahead and use it if you have it. But if you don't have a book press, rubber bands are a good option. Also, some kind of level surface that you can put a weight on, whatever heavy thing that you have will be useful. Also, newspaper rolls, and I'm talking about the rolls of newspaper rolled up really tight, can be a good reshaping tool if you have books, particularly the sewn binding books where the pages curve. The front edge of the pages curve. You want to maintain that curve if you're repairing the spine of that book. And we'll see where that's used when we get to the repair methods. Once again, they sell expensive options of this or versions of this, but a rolled up bit of newspaper rolled really tight works just as well. And then the last one, the bone folding tool, and I put in sanded paint stick because we'll get to that also. So the bone folding tool can range from really expensive to really cheap. You can get them in natural bone. You can get them in plastic. Plastic works just fine. It's a surprisingly useful tool for being as old as it is. It is an ancient tool. A zero cost option is to go grab a paint stick from your local hardware store and sand the edges smooth or to a rounded state like a bone folding tool would be. So that's a no-cost option. I've seen librarians use that too. Some like it better because the paint stick is a little bit bigger than the bone folding tool. So there's your list of supplies. Now I have to thank my sister, who is a library director. I called her up and I said, I need to show book repair methods. And she said, okay, and we recorded this and she sent me the video files. So I'm going to walk you through the repairing a torn page using glue rather than tape. So here we have a book, it's a paperback book, and we find that it has a tear. Now this is a very obvious tear, comes in all shapes and sizes, tears do. For this, you'll need your wax paper, and you can reuse your wax paper. You don't have to use it once and throw it away. She just has scraps and scraps of it in her repair drawer. So you want to put a piece of wax paper behind so you're not getting glue on any other pages. And you'll also want to have another piece of wax paper available for when you finish the repair. So here we have the Demco Norbond. I would suggest buying it in a smaller bottle because it does dry out pretty easily. And they say after about 6 months, even if you've kept it in a sealed bottle, that it might start to break down. They say this on the Demco website. So if you buy it in smaller bottles, depending on your volume of book repair, you're going to, smaller bottles one at a time, you're going to be able to have a better glue available. So in this case, she's going to look at the tear and look for the places where it is feathered the most. So where it's really fuzzy, and she's going to apply the glue to the most fuzzy parts of the tear. And sped up the video here because it does take a minute, and you notice she's just applying a very small amount at a time. You don't want to flood the page with glue. You just want to use enough, just enough, and she's cleaning up there against the wax paper. And I'm sorry again to those who are on the phone. I will be sending out a link to the presentation slides that will have the videos embedded in them, and so you'll be able to go back and watch the videos after the presentation. And as you can see, she's putting just enough glue there so it doesn't leak out or ooze out. And then you take that second piece of wax paper, put it over the repair, and then you can close the book. From here, you'll want to put some pressure on it for anywhere from 10 minutes to half an hour. You can just use, if it's a small tear, 1 point of pressure, but it's better if you can have something level to put on it and then the heavy weight, or put it in your book press. I would not suggest using rubber bands to compress it on this type of repair. So after 10 minutes, if you're needing that space, you can take the weight off and move the book elsewhere to dry. You'll need to let it dry for 24 hours at least. So next is tipping a page in. This is when a whole page has come out of a book. You can see this on glued bindings. You can see this on hybrid bindings. In this case, we're going to look at the damage on an oversized book here because it's a little easier to see on the wider spine. But this happens when the glue dries out and it is brittle and no longer holding the page in. When this happens, you can usually see if it's a hybrid binding where the holes are in the spine that they've made. Sometimes in this case, the pages will come out as a signature. These signatures are only one page folded. And you can see on the edge of the pages that came out where the glue just cracked out of the spine and lost the page. And so that's where you'd want to glue it back in. When you're tipping a page in, there's no way to be as precise as the original binding. So keep in mind you are kind of in a way over repairing the book. You're going to be gluing more of the page than was glued before, and you're creating another stress point. So to tip a page in, and this is on a thinner children's book. I'm gonna, oh, sorry. You want to look at it and take a look at how big that crack is. You'll need wax paper, once again, 2 pieces, and you'll need wax paper with a straight edge. You can get a straight edge by folding it in half, but for this kind of repair, you'll need a straight edge that you can get right up next to it. And you'll need your liquid plastic adhesive and your blunted wooden skewer to spread it. And this is where it's important that the skewer is of a smaller diameter. So you want to open that book as much as possible without causing further damage. If it's a thicker book with a thicker spine, you might find it more helpful to cradle the book in one hand to have it not open flat, or find other props when you're doing your repair. In this case, since it's a thin children's book, we can repair it flat. So she's just checking the fit of the page there, making sure that the page will fit back in the spine evenly. So you take your glue and you want to very carefully put it in the valley there. As much as possible, try not to get the glue on the adjoining pages. It can be a little difficult. You do have to be careful. Then you want to take that straight edge of your wax paper and scoot it as close to where the cracked spine is as possible without getting in the spine. Put your page or your signature and tip it in. This is where the name comes from. Tip it into that crack and lay it down carefully. Make sure your wax paper hasn't shifted. Make sure your page is lined up pretty well. And Rachel's, my sister, is saying this is where if you have it held at an angle, it can be a little bit easier if you have a thicker spine. And then you want to take your second piece of wax paper and lay it, sandwich that loose page with wax paper, lay it on the loose page, and then carefully close your book. I say carefully because the wax paper can shift around and the page can shift around, but you'll want to close it, make sure that the page is shoved in there as much as possible and it is straight as much as possible. And then you'll want to get your level surface and a heavy weight or put it in a book press. And once again, a minimum of 10 minutes to let the glue set up, longer if you can, and 24 hours to dry completely. Next, we're going to talk about an inside hinge repair. This is the kind of repair that you do when a tear has happened between the end paper and the flyleaf paper, or the end paper and a couple pages into the book. It usually happens at the front or the back of the book. So in this case, you will need, first of all, to make sure that, see, she's showing it can tear there also at the very back between the end paper and the flyleaf paper, or it can tear a little bit further in if that flyleaf has been glued pretty securely to the last page of the printed page of the book. This happens a lot in Frankenbindings. So in this case, you'll need your liquid plastic adhesive, your glue, and on your wooden skewer. In this case, you're spreading the glue actually on the pages and not in the hinge, since we are trying to preserve the flexibility of a sewn binding, of a sewn spine. We don't want to put glue in the crack and risk gluing the spine to the back of the cover. So you want to spread your glue on the pages, but try not to cover any actual print. So you're just putting it in the margins and the inside margins. Then you want to take your piece of tissue paper. You can use a good quality archival acid-free tissue paper, or they also sell something called Japanese tissue, which will be more translucent when glued and stronger. But really, for cost's sake, you can use archival quality buffered tissue paper. And you see she folded it in half to get it as close into the opening as possible, and she's smoothing it down on one side before using a bone folding tool or a wooden paint stick to smooth the other side down. This is because if you pick one part and try to smooth with your finger, you're going to get more likely to get wrinkles and bumps. And this way you can also sort of ease the paper in. Yeah, and I see in chat it says Demco also sells hinge repair tape. It does. It works really well. In this case, I'm suggesting the tissue for cost, and also because if you're doing a hinge repair closer to the middle of the book, you're going to want something that's not going to create more stress by being too thick. So if your repair is thicker than the paper, it's going to stress the book. And she's putting a piece of wax paper in there with a folded straight edge right up into the crease. And then you will want to make sure that all is straight and make sure that wax paper is pulled as close into the spine as possible. And then you will want to find your level surface and your heavy weight. And so same song, different verse. The big difference with this one, if you don't want to use a level surface and a heavy weight, depending on the spine, is that rolled up newspaper that I was talking about. So this is where you use your rolled up newspaper to maintain the curved shape of the front edges of the paper. And you can use rubber bands that are not too tight because you don't want to deform the spine and leave lines where the rubber bands were. And I would suggest, you can go with 2, but I would suggest 3 just to distribute the pressure evenly. If this was a paperback book, you could use the heavy weight. Since this is a sewn binding, you want to maintain the curved shape of those front edges. Next, we have fixing a split glued spine. This happens with paperbacks. And you see this a lot with paperbacks where they have used a cheap glue. So here, I never know how to pronounce, is it Jeanette Oak or Jeanette Oakey? I've heard it both ways. Anyway, I'm sure you've had similar books that have suffered the same damage. As you can see, she opens the book and a whole section of the book is pulled away from the spine as the glue is dried out and cracked. And so for this repair, you'll need your liquid plastic adhesive and your blunted wooden skewer, or they do sell paintbrushes for this glue. I've never found them particularly worth it because you have to remember to carefully wash the brushes after you're done, but that is an option. You want to be pretty liberal with this glue. You don't want it to ooze everywhere, but in this case, since you're working with a glued spine, you can be a little bit more generous. When you go to shut the book, you want to make sure that you're lining up those pages. You're not gluing it unevenly. You will want to put wax paper in the crease of the repair. If too much glue oozes out, you're gluing pages together. So to avoid that, you do want to use wax paper here. And go ahead and try to scoot it all the way up to as close as you can to the spine. Make sure the book is pretty square and the spine is straight. If it's a particularly wide break, you'll be able to smooth the glue underneath the spine when the book is closed. And from there, check that all the pages are straight. You can put the spine on the table flat to make sure they're straight. And that can be put under pressure or not, depending on how big the glued spine area. Next to last here, we're going to talk about taping a paperback cover. Once again, this is specifically for the outside of a paperback book, not the inside. This can be done as a preventative measure and as a repair measure. So the book that we're looking at here has very minimal damage, so I would almost call this a preventative measure, but it will work with further damage also. She's using a Scotch brand book tape roll, but there's other brands and different widths. So you want to look at how wide your spine is and choose the correct width. You want the tape to extend on both sides, the front and back cover, enough that the tape will be secure. You can also use polyethylene tape, which is different than book tape. Polyethylene tape is stretchy. It stretches a little bit, and the adhesive is a different quality. Polyethylene tape can be used on hardback books, cloth bound or paper hardback books. Or let's say you have a paperback book that has a kind of more rounded spine and you want to stretch the tape a little bit, you can use that also. Here she's measuring to make sure there's going to be enough tape to extend around the entire book. So from here, you'll want to cut a piece of tape a little bit longer than your spine. It's static electricity there. So you don't need to be precise, but just make sure it's longer than your spine. And for those of you who don't like working with tape and the adhesive sticks to your fingers, this is not going to be a pleasant repair. I'm sorry, but she suggests starting at the front cover and putting the tape on the front cover, smoothing it down with your bone folder, or in this case, her paint stick. And then you want to choose a center point to stretch the tape over the spine, smooth it down one way, and then smooth it down, excuse me, the other way. That eliminates a lot of bubbles. And then on the back, you want to lightly stretch the tape, stick it at a central point, and then use the bone folding tool. You could use the bone folding tool on the spine also, but some paperback books, the spine is not flat, and so it's better to use your fingers to make sure that you're getting even adhesion. And then you'll want to cut the excess tape away from the top and bottom. Pretty simple. Most librarians know how to do this, but we're including it because it is a basic repair that can also be a preventative measure. Another preventative measure and repair that you can do is to reinforce the corners, particularly on the front cover. There's some controversy about this because by reinforcing the corners, you're creating another stress point where the tape ends. But this can make shelving a lot easier for librarians. So you'll want to cut a rectangular piece of tape and we'll see here why we're cutting that much tape. It looks a lot more tape than you need for the corner. You'll want to place the tape on the corner as far up as you want to protect the corner, but so that it is extending about halfway, the corner of the book is extending about halfway down into the tape. And here's where you need to eyeball some things. You'll need to cut out a triangular piece of the tape. So the way you do that is you go along, let's say the bottom edge of the book, and you eyeball a line, and it doesn't need to be completely straight, but you eyeball a line that extends from the bottom edge of the book to the edge of the tape. And you cut to the point of the corner of the book. Excuse me, and then you'll want to turn your book and do the same thing with the edge of the front of the book. So you want to eyeball the edge of the front of the book down through the tape and then cut the tape up to the corner point of the book. Being careful not to cut the book itself. And then you remove that little triangle that you've cut. And from here you can open the front cover of the book and you can fold those flaps in one at a time. It's good to add a little bit of tension here because you want it to be the tape to be as flat as possible. And if you've cut it at the right angles, these should not extend beyond the bottom of the book or the side of the book. So there's one corner done, and then she will go through the other corner on the front cover of the book and a little sped up here so you can see it a little bit faster. I always think this is how long it feels it should take, even if it actually takes longer. And you can see here her angles were not as straight on as with the first repair. That still works also. She's found that she only needs to do the front corners. Those are the ones that get the most abuse, but you're welcome to do all four corners of the covers. Lastly, really quickly, stapling a children's book, or in this case, booklet. So, if you have these kind of books, you've seen the staples get loose, the middle pages fall out. A lot of the scholastic books that kids get in schools will have this booklet style binding. There are 2 staples in this spine, and we can see the middle page came out. So for this, all you will need is a long arm stapler. If you don't have one in your library, it's an excellent tool for a variety of reasons. This one extends all the way to the back edge there, and there's also a red stop that you can shorten the length of the stapler. But in this case, it's already at a point where we can fit the part of the book that we need to under there. This book, you notice we are stapling on the outside, and we're only going to put 1 staple in it. This is because we don't really want to add too much more weight to the staple binding than is necessary, and we are not removing the original staples either, so we can't staple over the original staples. So we're just putting 1 staple. You have to be very careful to line it up. Staples are more reversible than tape, but if you can get it on the first try, that's better. And you notice this middle staple is the same orientation as the other staples. In other words, the little sharp little prongs are on the inside. So that's so that people who are pulling the book from the shelf don't catch on their fingers or hands. So we went over those 4 repairs. Before we get to this, I'm going to ask if anybody has any questions about the repairs that we went over. And please remember to unmute yourself if you have questions, or type your questions in chat. To get us started, I'm going to say a lot of these repair methods borrow a lot from archival repair methods, but they have certain shortcuts. In the resources and further reading at the end of this presentation, I put some book repair instructions, textbooks, online textbooks. These are all from academic libraries or libraries that are more interested in preserving the original quality of the book. I think there's one link from the online book company Libris, who deals a lot in old books and historical books, where the better the repair method, if a book has been repaired, the more the book is worth. And so keep that in mind when looking at book repair methods. I will also say, in all of the book repair I've done, in all of the book repair classes that I've taken, a lot of people will think they have the right way to repair a book. And in the public library world, we can't afford to be that impractical. My philosophy is that if you know how to do the repair well, and it extends the life of the book for a few more circulations, then it's a good repair. We're not trying to preserve the monetary value of the book so much as the circulatory value, so much as its ability to circulate and still be used by library patrons. All right. And like I said, after when we send out this presentation recording or provide a link to it, we'll also provide a link to the actual presentation slides. And so you'll be able to go back and watch those videos also. So I thought it would be helpful to have a little bit of practice with what we've learned today. And these are also courtesy my sister, who is at the Port Library in Beloit, Kansas. I said, hey, can you pull some books off your repair shelf and just take some pictures of them? She said, when they're all damaged? I said, yes. So we're going to talk about these books. We're going to decide whether we would repair the book and put it back in circulation, we would weed the book, or we would buy a new copy. So those are our 3 options. So I would highly encourage you to unmute yourself and speak up, or type in chat what your opinion is. First of all, are we going to weed this book? Are we going to repair this book? Are we going to buy a new copy, and why?
I probably would just weed that book from the looks of the condition of the outside edges, and it's a paperback, and I don't suppose I would take the time or the effort to repair that.
Yeah, and Ginny says buy a new copy if it gets used a lot, and so does Mary. I did not ask Rachel what the circulation statistics were, or if there are more copies at other libraries. I did ask her to tell me, what she would do in each case. This one, she said she was still trying to decide. This is one that her children's librarian had pulled, and she had asked the children's librarian, is that still being circulated? She said that they have other books in that series, and so on the one hand, she was reluctant to get rid of it entirely because she would be missing a book out of the series, and it still does get some use when a child gets interested in that series. They want that book, but she was still on the fence whether to repair it or to buy a new copy or to see if it was going to receive more circulation. So no right or wrong answer here. Yeah, and yeah, Reva says my kids love Captain Underpants. Yeah, so I mean, in this case, it would depend on your local circulation. So yeah, and Diana said repair until you can buy a new copy. And yes, in this case, maybe I generally do not advocate taping pages back in, but in this case, if you're just trying to get it through one or two more circulations until a new copy can be purchased, I would consider using a thin tape, a very thin tape. Okay. Oh, there we go. All right, on to the next one. So this one is 2 pages, so I'll go back and forth between the pages. This is a children's book. It's a board book. It's Let's Look for Colors, Mickey Mouse Clubhouse book. As you can see, the cover is starting to come away from rip away from the spine, but it's still holding on by the outside paper of the cover. It is also a lift the flap book, and you can see some damage around the flaps and on the edge of the board book here. So we go on to the next page is a close-up of more of that damage. You can see that it's been taped before. One of the flaps had been taped before. So, and we can also see some signs of dirt and soil on the page. So I'll go back to that first page of pictures. All right, and I'm seeing a lot of people are saying weed the book, just weed the book. Did anybody have any other comments or things they wanted to say about it? Yeah, Sarah says, looks like there's quite a bit of additional wear. Depending on the circulation, either weed it or put in a temporary repair until a replacement can be made. Yeah, and Kara says, weed board books do get a lot of wear. They do get a lot of wear and tear. So, yeah. And just to tell you, in fact, Rachel said that she would choose to weed this book, this board book. So that's what her decision is going to be. She had it on the repair shelf because she wanted to make note of the title to try to replace it with something similar. So here we have another 2-page of pictures. This is another board book. It has a handle on one side. It does not have flaps like the inside flaps you can lift like the other board book, but you can see from the pictures there's even more of a split in the spine, and it's really only being held together by the outside paper on the spine. You can also see that some tape on the outside cover. It's been taped before. So a lot of people say weed and replace, or just weed. Just go ahead and weed. I'm seeing in the chat. When I was talking with her about this book and why she decided to do what she did, she said this one was a little bit harder to decide. She did, in the end, decide to weed it, but she wanted to make a little bit more effort to replace it than the previous board book, because she found that this particular board book was very popular with the smaller children because they could pick it up by the handle easier. The handle made it easier to carry for small hands that are still learning how to be, learning dexterity and how to grab things. So there's My Little Tractors. And not Demco, excuse me, DK Books. She might be able to find an exact copy replacement. Yeah, they're good quality books, but I think even the best quality books break down under children's wear and tear. All right, so there's the tractor. On to adult books. This is a paperback by Diana Palmer called Men of the West. 3 novels in one. It is glue binding because it's a paperback. So let's talk about this one. Just based on, and you can ask me questions, but based on the pictures, what would you do with this book? I will note, it appears the major damage is the upper edge on the spine. Front cover is starting to lift away from the spine. So yeah, repair. You could repair it. It's not in horrible shape. Repair. Yeah, book repair tape on the binding is probably what I would suggest also. I would note that this might be a time to consider weeding it, though, if it's not circulating. Yeah. So check how much it's circulating, but also check how available it is through interlibrary loan. We have a Diana Palmer fan that says sometimes the titles are hard to get. I assume because they're out of print, more recently, but out of print. Yeah, make sure you can get it at another library and then weed. Yeah, and I asked her, and she said, yeah, she probably put book tape on it and put it back in the back on the shelf. She said, you know, there's still room for it on the shelf, and it's still in good shape. And so that was her final decision on that book. We have one more book here. This is a adult hardback book, and we can tell by looking, or at least I can tell by looking at the spine and looking at the damage, that this was a hybrid binding. So even though it's a hardback book, it's not a sewn binding. You can, and it is started to split. The hinge is broken more in the middle of the book. And we can see there's an end view of the book, and we can see where the pages are sticking out that are broken. So a lot of people are saying weed it or replace it if it's a popular book, but just go ahead and weed it. So I thought this one was interesting. She did not send me the cover, so we don't know what the book is or who it's by, unless anybody wants to squint at the tiny print. So there's also, yes, at SEK headquarters, there's a machine called Cover One, which is a machine that basically works by reheating the glue and glued bindings, so hybrid bindings and paperback. It is available for librarians to use if they want to come all the way to Iola, and Kim Burns can help you use it. You could also choose to repair this at your library if you're going to repair it with the Norbond glue, like we went over. It would you'd have to repair it kind of a little bit like a glued binding, but also a little bit like a sewn binding. So you want to put some glue along the spine, but since it's a hybrid binding, you'll want to glue it to the spine. So yeah, some people suggested making book art out of it. Yes, I mean, some book art requires you to remove the pages and you're just using the book cover, and this is already half done for you. You've already started to remove the pages. So that's an option if you're going to weed it. And some, Daryl said it looks like a poor binding. It is. Hybrid bindings tend to be poorer as they get older. They initially have the strength of a sewn binding, but then when the glue dries out, they're just as weak as a paperback binding. So Rachel said that she decided to go ahead and repair this book because it would still receive enough circulation. Like I said, she didn't send me the title of this book, so I'm taking her word for it that it still gets enough circulation to warrant repair. But yes, I see Sarah said, or excuse me, Susan said it might be difficult to repair at our library. And this is something that you have to take into consideration, is your skill level at repairing books. I mean, if you don't feel confident enough to make that repair, no one's forcing you to make that repair. That is your judgment call. All right, so that was all of the interaction. So we have resources and further reading. I will just highlight a few of these here and then open it up for questions. The webinar is scheduled to go until 2:30, but this is not a classroom. I'm not going to keep you until the bell, but I did want to open it up for other questions or discussion about weeding and book repair. I have listed here the crew manual, a link to the PDF or the ebook of it. There is an article from American Libraries and an article from Library Journal. There's also the ALA's Selection and Reconsideration Policy Toolkit, a link specifically to their section on weeding and writing policies about weeding. For the book repair resources, there's a couple of book repair manuals that are, one that's a PDF, one that is available as a PDF, but I linked to the web page version of it. There is a slideshow from ACL TS that is a few years old but still worth looking at. And there's a good list of book repair and restoration articles from Alibris. While it is a commercial company, I looked through their resources there, and they've got some good resources, so I included it. And then 3 basic book repair procedures. It's a little bit older. The website itself is a little bit older, from Book Arts Web, but it is a website and a group that's been around since the early days of the internet, and their website looks like it. And then also, if you're interested in further reading, a little bit of further reading on the history of paper. So there's a lot of the information I pulled from those sources, including a Wikipedia article. Once again, this particular Wikipedia article is well referenced, well written and well referenced, so I'm comfortable providing it as a source in this case. All right, I'm going to stop sharing. All right, so you can all see my face again. And did we have any other questions or discussions or suggestions for repair that I did not cover?
When you are reading books and you come across books that you're just taking off the shelf simply because they haven't been checked out for a while, what do you do with these books that you take off the shelves? Right now, I'm trying to give them to students and, you know, trying to get rid of them in different ways, but I still end up with boxes upon boxes of books.
Well, unfortunately, there's no magic wand to wave here. And one of the articles that I linked to from either Library Journal or American Libraries does talk about what you do with the weeded books. It touches on, but this is an ongoing discussion. So some libraries put these books in their book sale, whether it's an annual book sale or an ongoing book sale run by the Friends group. Some libraries donate these to different organizations, and these, there's not enough, let's put it this way. There are different organizations that you can donate to, but I hesitate to list any one organization because it seems like one year they'll accept donations and one year they won't. But I would look into organizations such as local thrift shops, if there's a used bookstore anywhere near, women's shelters, foster family support groups, children's services support groups. I would look into also, I know that I know of libraries that maybe receive donations that are still in good shape, but they don't want to. I see area VA hospitals is a very good suggestion. libraries that get donations that they're still in good shape, but they don't want to add them to the collection for whatever reason. I've seen libraries put away giveaway baskets that it's just you enter to win, and people seem to really like that. And that way you can maybe slip in a few books that you don't know how else you're going to get rid of them, along with a few more popular titles. It's a little sneaky, but it works. And then the sad truth is, at some point, some of these books are going to end up in the trash. I would hope that you would choose to find someplace to recycle them, but the sad truth is that some books end up in the trash. Morgan suggests nursing homes or assisted living facilities, and there's also the take for free cart that a lot of libraries have. If you're doing a continuous weeding, this is easier to do. If you do weeding as a one project at one point in the year, it can be a lot harder to figure out what to do with the books.
There are also many art projects, and you can look on Pinterest as one place, using old books.
Yes, yeah, Pinterest has a lot of great suggestions. Personally, I've seen, what are they called? Book nooks. You use book covers and you make a little winding street. Daycare centers are another option if you have children's books that are still in decent shape. Thank you, Loretta. And craft projects. I've seen that suggested a couple times. You could even make a library program out of, if you find a simple enough book craft project, you can supply the books and have a craft project. Yeah, Mary says sometimes board members do not understand that you cannot keep every book forever. Yeah, I think this goes back to one of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is a little bit preaching to the choir here, but the library is a living organism. And like any living organism, you have waste, as well as the new books coming in.
So I'm a little undecided about how old a nonfiction book would be before you would weed it.
So the answer to that question is it depends on the subject matter. Medical books, generally, if they're older than 5 years, are considered out of date. A lot of nursing schools and medical schools, that's their cutoff, is 5 years. If it's something in the math area of math, that doesn't really have an expiration date, or history does not really have an expiration date. And so in that case, I would lean towards looking at the circulation statistics, the interests of your community, if they're interested, like in the case of history. And I would also look at, in the case of the math books, for example, even if the information is still accurate, is it still presented in an appealing manner? This is very much a judgment call. I don't have it one way, or I don't have a firm answer one way or the other. It depends on your library and their needs. I would say one area that needs to be weeded as often as the medical books would be the social sciences. So you need to take a look at your books having to do with, in the 300s is what I'm talking about, society, law, education, and make sure that those are still up to date.
What about books? Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
what about books that still have Pluto in them as a planet?
Well, this is, what a great example. So this is where, you need to be careful. Maybe if they're children's books that still list Pluto as a planet, you might want to consider reading those, especially if they're not being used. I think adults would understand that, the information about this has changed over time. First Pluto was a planet, and then it wasn't a planet, and then it was, what do they call it, like a exoplanet or something. They still included it with all the other planets, but they're not calling it a planet. So that's an excellent example.
Okay.
So all right, did anybody else have any questions about weeding or book repair? I would highly suggest that you look at the crew manual. Make sure that your library has a weeding policy on the books, and keep in mind that a policy is separate from procedure. So a policy sort of lays out the fact that we do weed, and we do have a criteria for weeding, and who decides what to weed. But the actual criteria that you use would be in a procedure. So I would encourage you to make sure that you have that in your policy manual, that just a statement saying we do weed, here's the person who does it, and we do follow a criteria. So Kathy asks, when using wax paper and removing it, does it remove easy? What if it sticks? Wax paper works really well with the Norbond adhesive. So I would say the answer to that question is it depends on the glue that you're using. It depends somewhat on the quality of the wax paper also. Don't go with the super thick wax paper, but don't go with the super cheap wax paper either. This is where, if you're nervous about it, I would look into the commercially available book repair supplies. They do have, yeah, and April says it usually doesn't stick with Norbond. They do have papers, lining papers, specifically for the different types of glue. So, well, you're welcome, Loretta. I'm glad you learned so much. If nobody else has any more questions, I would please ask everyone again, if you have not, to write your name and the library that you're from in the chat so that we can take attendance, so to speak, for accreditation. Oh, June, thank you. So her last name is pronounced Oak. Okay. I'm glad I was right. Jeanette Oak. Her last name is pronounced Oak. See, I learned something. That was great. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much. I hope you have a good weekend. I hope you're all staying healthy and safe and well. And I'm thinking about you. And hang in there.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.